welcome back to another episode of the Point of Order podcast. I am Assemblyman Josh Hoover, your host, and I am very excited about today's podcast because we are joined by a very special guest. Tani Cantil-Sakauye is here with us. Tani is the CEO and president of the Public Policy Institute of California, or what we'll refer to on this podcast as PPIC, because it's a little shorter. And she also is the former Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. Tani, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Assemblyman Hoover. It's a privilege to be here with you. Thank you for the honor.
Absolutely. And I'm just so excited to have this conversation. You know, a lot of this podcast during the legislative session is kind of about what's going on that week in legislative, the session or in California politics. But this time of year, we get to focus more on kind of learning more about California. So we've had a podcast on California's legislative history. We've had a podcast on the budget process, things like that. And today I'm really excited to chat with you, obviously about your work at PPIC, but also your history in the judicial branch, which I think a lot of people would be interested to learn more about. So if you want to get started with, just tell us a little bit about your background, what got you into the role you're in now, but just kind of what got you interested in public policy.
Well, thank you. My background is that I am born and bred Sacramento. My mother was a farm worker turned state worker, and my father came from Hawaii, a sugarcane field worker who also came into work here in the federal government. So I'm a product of the Sacramento area public schools, and I came to the law primarily from an accumulation of interest as a child and a young adult. Our family was evicted from our home primarily because of eminent domain, and we had to move. And I remember the unrest and the shock of an 8 to 9-year-old who's told for the first time that government can, in fact, take your home.
Wow.
And so it was in community college and with the help of my mother that I began to think about the law. And I was fortunate enough to go to UC Davis King Hall School of Law, and from there entered into public service.
That's amazing. What was your first foray into public service?
My first foray into public service was when I started as a lawyer. I was 23, 24, and I couldn't find a job. It was a terrible market, and I applied everywhere. And finally, I received a probationary stint in the district attorney's office in Sacramento County. I had taken all of my electives in business. I didn't know anything about criminal law and the courtroom. And so I was on a probationary status there for a year.
Yeah.
And they gave me a file in my first week and said, go across the street and try this case. And I said, where do I go to try this case? But I tried it, and I loved the courtroom.
That is so cool. So you really, how long were you in the courtroom for?
I was in the DA's office for about 4.5 years, 4 years or so before there was an opening in the governor's office in his inner circle, in his immediate staff.
Yeah.
And I, like every other public-private lawyer in Sacramento and beyond, interviewed for that position.
Wow.
And I was lucky enough to be able to walk away with the position.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, and then after that, that led you, how'd you get into the policy world?
Well, I got into the policy world in the governor's office with just being there as the deputy legal affairs secretary handling legal matters and then handling legislative matters. So we divided the California codes among all of his legislative people, and I had a series of codes and became involved in policy. But it wasn't really until I went to the bench, Governor Deukmejian appointed me to the Judiciary, I think as one of the youngest judges at the time in 1990.
Amazing.
And I became involved in policy, primarily then criminal law, because that's what I was doing when I first came on the bench, and later with civil law. And then later on, fast forward some 20 years at the trial court, 14 years in the trial court, 6 years at the Court of Appeal, and then Governor Schwarzenegger names me Chief Justice.
Amazing.
I stand statewide election, and now I am deep in policy, and I find out that it is my second love after the courtroom.
That's amazing. Yeah. So you were appointed Chief Justice under the Schwarzenegger administration. So how does that work? Is the chief only appointed if there's an opening at that position? Is that how the nominations work?
Exactly. The Chief Justice position is a distinct position in California, not true in other states.
Got it.
So when Chief George retired, there was an opening and Governor Schwarzenegger appointed me, and then I stood for statewide election.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So what was it like being appointed to the Supreme Court? Like, what were some of the things that went through your mind at that time? And how bit, I mean, it's just a tremendous honor, obviously, but...
It is. It was a fair amount of fear and trepidation and anxiety because I had not been served on the Supreme Court before, and the members there, all 6 of them, were people I revered in the law. And I was coming in as the newbie and as their chief, sitting at the head of the table running the business. But they were wonderfully thoughtful, kind people who were very kind and taught me along the way. It was also a time of great anxiety because we were in the middle of the Great Recession. So we were closing courthouses and closing courtrooms, and everyone was angry. And we had to work our way through it all. And we had to work it out together because it serves no one to be in conflict in the branch. I spent a lot of time in the legislature in 2011 and 12 and 13 trying to get the judicial branch of government restored so that we could make good on the laws, the good laws that you all propose and the governor signs.
And that was post after the Great Recession. Then, what was when you were kind of doing that advocacy work when the budget was starting to come back, or was that?
Yes and no. No, when I came in 2011 in January, the budget was still in free fall.
It was still in a bad place.
And I was told, we don't believe we've hit rock bottom yet, so we're cutting you. We're closing and I closed courthouses and closed courtrooms and laid people off and gave golden handshakes to administrators to try to shrink our footprint and our costs.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. What a time to be appointed too. So that is really challenging.
It was, but it was also a great time because we came together.
Yeah.
And we had no choice but to come together, and everyone was concerned. So it was a time where, in crisis, everyone was trying to do their best.
Yeah. What were some of the kind of your most memorable moments being on the Supreme Court, whether it be decisions or obviously challenges as you've discussed with the budget? But I mean, what were some of the more memorable moments for you as Chief Justice?
Well, I would say, generally speaking, and I know you'll understand this because you're with the Problem Solvers Caucus.
Yes.
As the Chief Justice of California running the third branch, we are all about solving the problems. And as the third branch, we like to bring to you, the legislative branch and the governor, solutions and multiple solutions. So memorable for me was really being in a place at the top of the third branch to be able to effectuate change and bring options and ideas and alternatives to the legislature and to the governor about going forward. So for me, one of the highlights was working with the legislature, working with all the different stakeholders, from legal aid to the plaintiffs' lawyers, to the civil defense lawyers, to the victims programs, to the prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys. It's being able to meet with all of them and ask them what's wrong and how can we fix it.
Absolutely.
So that's incredibly memorable to me about that. And of course, being a jurist on the Supreme Court, the chief carries the same caseload as her colleagues. So I'm writing decisions, authoring decisions, the same as they are. So we also get a bird's eye view of what's working, what laws work and what laws aren't working.
That's fantastic.
That was a policy eye opener too.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I think it's interesting because, you go to, you grow up in grade school and you kind of go to college and you learn a lot about the executive branch, right? The executive branch gets a lot of the attention, whether it be the president or the governor, right? And then you learn some about the legislative branch and about, the importance to make laws. But I feel like the least that we learn about as kids and as, even in school is about the judiciary, even though it is one of those 3 main branches in our government. What are some things, like, what is the judiciary's role and why do you think it's so important for our system?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you. Well, I start with the fact that the founders of our nation who drafted the Constitution and the Bill of Rights understood that power has to be divided. Otherwise, power is corrupted. Yeah. And so they knew power couldn't vest in one branch, like the king or the emperor, because they'd been oppressed by that. And they knew that two sources of power would lead to a tie and would lead to paralysis. So our founders tried this experiment in democracy and decided 3 branches of government, an executive, a legislative, and a judiciary, and decided that all of them would work together, a three-legged stool, and they would all check and balance each other. And it was the first time in the history of the world that power had been divided in this way. And California is a microcosm of how that works. And I mean really works. And so the judiciary in California is the largest law-trained judiciary in the United States, the most diverse, and probably therefore the world. And because our judiciary is made up of our lawyers, and many states don't require judges to be lawyers, but California does, we draw from a very talented population of lawyers. We have the largest bar association in the world. No surprise how many lawyers we have, over 200,000 in California.
Wow.
And we draw from them, and they need at least 10 years experience to be qualified to be a jurist in the first instance. So our judiciary has a quality group of, bench to create the bench. And we take input and work with the legislative branch and the executive branch, but we check each other. So, for example, I could write a decision as the Chief Justice. The legislature may not like it. You could write a bill. You could overrule it.
Sure.
The governor could sign it. And therefore, my case is dead and we have a new law. But that's how it works.
That's the system, right?
It's supposed to work that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of requires that conversation and that debate, which is the beauty of it, I think, too. So that's amazing. What about the Judicial Council? What is their role, and kind of how do they kind of integrate into all of this?
I love that question. Thank you. Thank you. And if we were just a collection of courts, we would be 58 superior courts, 6 courts of appeal, 1 Supreme Court, 2,000 jurists, and a whole lot of voices.
That's a lot.
Early on, the legislature back in 1927 said, you people over here need to have some organization. And the legislature put on the ballot for the people to vote on a council, which would be the head, sort of the board of directors. And so it was the legislature that created that for the judiciary.
That's amazing.
It is. And so all of the problems in the judiciary are supposed to come first to the council. And then when we need a 3-branch solution, which we often do, we come to you.
Okay.
So the legislature said, and that's the law, that the Chief Justice shall chair the Judicial Council. So I chaired the council, and it's our governing body. It is our board of directors, our policy and rulemaking body. There's about 31 members from all over California, judges, lawyers, and professional court staff. And we do everything from writing the jury instructions, to maintaining buildings, to building courthouses, to providing service and aid to those courts in counties that might not have the funds, like the smaller counties, Trinity, Del Norte, Inyo, smaller counties that need services that they can't pay for or provide, versus LA, San Francisco, and San Diego, which have huge populations and a base of professionals that they can stock their courts with. So the Judicial Council serves to do what the courts cannot do for themselves. And as the chief, I ran it, and then therefore worked closely with the legislative branch and the executive branch to bring home the judicial branch budget, where you all would say to me, that costs too much. No, you can't proceed on that pilot project. And we worked together to build a judiciary, to build a budget, to provide justice to 39 million Californians.
That's amazing. Yeah, and it is, it's such an important role too. I remember I've worked for a number of members over the years of the legislature, some of which obviously Sacramento County or Orange County, but some in the more rural areas such as Riverside and San Bernardino County, where so much of what we were advocating for was funding for judgeships, funding for courthouses, in the more rural parts of California, it really is a challenge. And I'm sure that, that will continue to be the case, but I remember that very vividly, always having to kind of fight for those areas.
Right. During my administration, I took on the cause of the Inland Empire, its explosive growth of millions of people in San Bernardino and Riverside, the needs of that court, the overload, the caseload, so much justice needing to be done. Those counties need many, many, many more lawyers. Many, many, many more judges. And both Governor Brown and Governor Newsom have been good about authorizing and paying for more judgeships. But the truth is, those counties still need more. Yeah.
No, it's definitely, we kind of talked about this on a previous podcast recently, but the state budget obviously not looking fantastic at the moment. The legislative analyst just came out a few days ago And this will be released in the new year. But, the legislative analyst said we were facing a $68 billion budget deficit. What kind of impact is that going to have on the court system?
I anticipate that there will be a huge impact on the court system. When I came into office in 2011 and Governor Brown was starting his second stint as governor, the budget deficit was something under $30 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And we had been closing courthouses and
Wow.
courtrooms. As an appellate justice prior to that time during the Great Recession, I worked for free. So many of us decided that we would not take a paycheck for certain days of the month. We called in retired judges and asked them to work for
Wow.
free. But that was the time where we cut staff from hundreds. We laid staff off. We did golden handshakes to get staff to move on.
Yeah.
We shrunk our footprint. We closed multiple courthouses in Los Angeles County. We ended up also ending court early, ending not having any court on some Fridays because we couldn't pay staff. We ended up not having people help at the windows or answer at the service windows or answer the phones. Everyone was affected. Everyone shared in the cuts, and it was really hard for justice and hard for the legislature and hard for the executive branch.
Yeah, and honestly, the impacts of that on the justice system and on the people that are impacted by those delays and those shortfalls, is substantial too, I'm sure.
Yes. I will only add that it seems like in crisis like that certain kinds of crimes and civil violations increase, like wage theft, like evictions, the really bread and butter of people's lives, their paychecks, their homes and families really fall apart. You need the courts open more than ever, particularly the family law courts, particularly the civil courts, to provide the kind of hard stop that prevents that kind of crime.
Absolutely.
And people being taken advantage of.
Yeah, and efficient, in an efficient way too, right?
Yes.
Like I think that's the challenge. Is,
yes.
Ensuring that we don't have delayed justice as well. So I really appreciate you sharing a little bit about your time on the court. Obviously, you're now doing something new. I guess, how long have you been at the PPIC now?
Almost a year.
Okay, so yeah, still pretty, that's great. So the Public Policy Institute of California is one of my favorite organizations. I was so excited when you moved over there because I think, it's just such an important part of the policy process in California. But tell us a little bit about your work at PPIC and maybe, some of your vision for what you want to see PPIC do over the next few years.
Thank you. Well, I first have to thank you for being one of our speakers for the local control funding formula and the insights you provided that will spur
Absolutely.
changes going forward. And that's one of the things we do at PPIC. We bring leaders together to speak to the public. We offer an open, free lunch at the Sheraton, for example, online and in person, and we bring experts like yourself to talk about what California needs in terms of policy and policy direction. So let me say that after 12 years on the California Supreme Court and leading the third branch, I was about to re-up and put my papers in for another 12 years. And then I learned that there was an opening at the Public Policy Institute of California. Like you, I'd been an avid fan of their material because it's nonpartisan, data-driven research on some of our most important issues. And I've read them and used their work. And so I all of a sudden became interested in that. And we got together and ultimately they offered me the position. And I will say the reason I took it in part is because policy is the precursor to law. And I often call law the children of policy. And as the Chief Justice of California, working through really tough decisions in California, we grapple with policy. But as a judicial branch, we don't make the law.
Correct.
But we certainly work through it and say, wow, this could be better.
You see the challenges.
Yes.
For sure. Yeah.
And so I wanted to be on the front end
Yeah.
of policy making that influences law rather than on the back end saying this isn't really working, it doesn't cover this situation. So I had an opportunity to be on the front end of policy rather than the back end of it. And so at PPIC, as the president and CEO, we're 30 years old come next year. We're probably one of the oldest, longest think tanks. And we survive because of the excellence of our work, because we're nonpartisan, because our work is based solely on data that is peer reviewed by academics and the academy and scholars, and by the organizations in the industry that is affected by the work we produce. And we cover most of California's most important issues, from education, K-12, to higher education, to criminal justice, to water policy, to the economy, to the safety net, the programs that help the most vulnerable in California. So we're about 85 people strong. We are primarily PhDs, research fellows who are putting out the research. But we've also learned over time to be more digestible. Some folks want, your staff wants the 60-page report really with 200 appendices. But some readers just want a blog or a fact sheet or an explainer.
Sure.
And so we provide all manner of ways of digesting this information, and it's all free. We are independent. We operate solely from an endowment from 30 years ago, and also from grants. And we don't accept money if the grantor has a point of view that it's expecting us to find.
That's good to know.
Yeah, so we're a charitable trust, and we work from data. We're busy with data agreements and keeping everybody honest and in their lane. And I'm learning so much about California and working with so many great groups about furthering the California dream. Many people think it's dying. PPIC is working to ensure that the challenges to the California dream remain at the forefront of leaders' decisions like yourself.
That's awesome. And I love that you mentioned the kind of the differences in the reports versus maybe the bullet points or the fact sheets, because I mean, it's amazing how things have changed with the social media and just the speed of media these days, right? Is so quick, and I feel like people's attention spans are a little shorter than they used to be. So having that digestible material is really great as well.
Well, yes, I think that people's attention spans are shorter, and primarily because there's just so much more out there.
There is so much.
So the consumption
there's
is
only so
mass,
much room,
right?
Exactly,
and so there's quantity of mass, and so and before it was less. But we provide. I like to think that we provide really critical thinking pieces. Our pieces are written for solutions, and we like to say, it's not a Democrat problem. It's not a Republican problem. This is a problem that all of us can solve because it's important to California.
Well, and there are so few, I feel like, organizations that have established themselves as obviously nonpartisan, reliable information you can trust. There's only a handful of organizations out there that I can think of that have done that specific to California policy. Obviously, the Public Policy Institute of California being one of them, the Legislative Analyst's Office being another. But there are only a handful of places that I feel like I can go for the true, balanced and unbiased perspective. And so it's really, really special.
Thank you. I do want to say, too, I know that you appreciate this as a leader. And this is just my training as a lawyer and a judge, but the facts are critical. I appreciate people's opinions, and I find them informative and sometimes quite entertaining. But at the same time, I need to start with the facts. And that's my greatest love about PPIC is we start with the facts, and we choose to write carefully, not in an inflammatory or opinionated way such that it looks like we have a position, because we don't. We really want you, the leaders, to have what you need to then argue, vet, strategize, and use. And as the Chief Justice or as a judge or a lawyer, that's what we all start with. We have to start with the facts, otherwise our result is skewed from the beginning. And I think in this day and age, referring back to something you mentioned earlier, I think critical thinking is a lost art, and we really try to model that at PPIC.
That's awesome. And you don't need to opine on this, but that is one of my frustrations with kind of the state of our politics is the facts have kind of taken a back seat to a lot of other things. And I think that's why it's so important we have organizations like PPIC that are keeping them front and center. So
thank you.
Now, so in addition, so PPIC does, you mentioned the speaker series, obviously the reports. you also do polling, correct? And really kind of gauging Californians on issues and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about the work you do there?
Yes. Oh, that's probably one of our premier products is our survey.
Yeah.
And our survey has been going on for decades now. And our survey director is Mark Baldessari, who used to be the CEO and president of PPIC. And the only reason he stepped back was to write a book on policy in California.
Wonderful.
And so he is still our survey director, and he is still with PPIC on a limited time basis so he can write his book.
Yeah.
And he does do about 7 to 8 surveys a year with the survey team.
Okay.
And they study, and most recently, Californians and how they feel about their government and the environment. And he polls, as you know, California voters, likely voters, different age groups, and we are looking especially toward next year in the election year, the polling that he will conduct. That polling is independently funded, so we're always looking for independent funding, and we really mean independent funding about the polls and the results. And as you know, the beauty of one of Mark's polls is that they are also cross-tabbed, so you're able to go to your region and see what the people in your region, at least those who responded, are thinking about the survey. And then we also take the survey, and like we do with our other reports, we turn them into brief videos, Q&As. We turn them into talking exchanges to make them come alive. And we've been very successful with the survey. Mark is really a wizard at it and gets a lot of admiration. He's in touch with all of the top pollsters and how polling has changed and what they're using, et cetera.
That's amazing. I mean, it is. And I've had conversations with Mark about his process, and it really is fantastic. And it's helpful, too, for policymakers to know where Californians are, how they're feeling, what issues are most important to them. I think is really important for policymakers to be aware of. You also get some really interesting, information, sometimes conflicting information that's really hard to deal with, right? Like I was reading a survey they did recently on housing and how something like over 70% of Californians still really they want single family homes. That was one of the results of the survey. But I think a similar number want livable, walkable communities where everyone can walk everywhere. And it's interesting, right? Because those are things as a policymaker, you're like, well, how do you balance these two things? Sometimes people kind of want everything, and and it's hard as a policymaker to balance that. But it's just really fascinating to read some of the surveys.
You have put your finger exactly on the pulse. I review all the publications before they're released, and I'm fascinated by what I learned from our really smart researchers. And when I see the survey, I write back, great survey, no questions from me. And then I ask, how can this be? and Mark says, yeah, you're right. We're just doing the survey. We really aren't doing the psychoanalysis
the question,
of it.
Right? Yeah. It's amazing. And I think, that's kind of what makes the legislative function so difficult, right? Is you do have a lot of conflicting kind of opinions and priorities, but even things that that are not always going to be compatible, and you have to find a way to craft policy around that.
Yeah, so you have a hard job.
It's
yes,
fun.
You do.
It's fun. It's gonna, but it's just fantastic, and I love the survey aspect of the work you're doing too. The last thing I wanted to ask you about was you also, and I'm going to read this so that I don't mess it up, but you hold the Walter and Esther Hewlett Chair in Understanding California's Future. That is a position you hold at the PPIC. Tell me a little bit about that position and kind of what the goals are of that.
Thank you. Well, let me start by a little historical perspective. PPIC was started 30 years ago by 3 visionary leaders who said 30 years ago, California needs a nonpartisan data research-based think tank, and we mean that so sincerely, we're going to put our own money up.
That's amazing.
And one of those was Hewlett.
That's amazing.
And the other was the president of the UCs at the time, Roger Hines. And the third was the dean of Stanford Business School, R.J. Miller. So Hewlett has always been this incredible visionary for PPIC. And so this Walter and Esther Hewlett Chair in Understanding California's Future is a position and a policy focus at PPIC. As you know, we have about 7 other policy focuses, but this is Understanding California's Future is exactly what this study and focus area is. What does California's future look like? And so under UCF, that's what we call it, we're looking at trends and patterns shaping California and alerting decision makers like yourself as to what this means. So, and Understanding California's Future, we're looking at the demographics of California, which are radically different than they were 15 years ago. And under the demographics heading, for example, we published a blog that was really well and long. Those are went viral, essentially, about who's leaving California. And the first time ever in California's emigration out, we docked that people who are upper middle class are leaving and people with education, college degrees are leaving. That is different from what it's been in other years of California's out migration. We're also learning that in the demographics, for example, birth rates are declining. Immigration is flat, and we also have this aging population, excuse me, which tells us that California's future population is going to look very different.
Wow.
We also know that of the children in public schools today, most of them, 52%, are Latino. So we know the population demographics are going to look different. And we know about our economy and housing, our challenges. We're concerned that the California dream is dying.
Yeah.
So
I share that concern for sure.
I'm sorry. Yes, so that's what we're writing to. And we're going to study governance, the politics of what parties are what, voting, how that's working. We're studying also California interests. And the most important piece for me of this chair and this focus is we're going to do a heavy civics engagement piece.
That's fantastic.
With either K through community college and bringing students along for future critical thinking.
And I think that's critical. And I think in some ways we have lost some of that civics focus in today for kind of the next generation. And it's really important that they understand and appreciate, the importance of civic engagement and civics education. And that's fantastic, though. That sounds great.
Well, when I was the Chief Justice back in 2012, I started the civics program for the Judiciary called The Power of Democracy. And we started teaching the 3 branches of government to K through 12. During the pandemic, we zoomed in and did the same, but this time we did it in Spanish and in Mandarin to reach different schools. And the teachers find it to be a big assistance to them.
Yeah.
And we teach projects, and the kids have projects and do a lot of collaborative critical thinking. And so I'm taking many of those pieces to PPIC so that we can bring on the students and we can include them and take some of our material and get it to a level that makes it understandable, relevant to them. And we're going to partner with other civics organizations to do the same so that we are all in this together.
That's amazing. It's funny. I've been speaking to a few different high school classes over the last year that I've been in the legislature, which is one of my favorite things to do. The questions that I get from, the next generation of kids, the students that are coming through our system right now is just, they always blow my mind, and it's just such a great experience. And there's such a hunger for, wanting that knowledge and, learning about the world around them. So,
I'm glad you do that. That's so important for the students, not only to have the ability to have an engagement face-to-face with you, but also for you to share your journey because they can see themselves in that and see that it's possible. I do the same as well. And I find that there is a hunger. And to the point you made earlier about social media, I try to get them to go to our webpage, and I try to get them to think about reading multiple sources and to have their own opinion. Don't let someone tell you what your opinion is.
Yeah.
And so I do enjoy that.
And I always try to impart that on my kids as well, right? It's important to learn how to think critically, not necessarily what to think, right? But, I think the education system is about teaching you how to ask the right questions, how to analyze something in a critical way and always, so that you can get to the answer that you're looking to find. So
yes, I fully agree. And I think a lot of that is your sources.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sure like you, I look at the paper, I need to read things. Well, there's some sources I just won't read. They're not useful to me.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But then there are other sources, and I'll read multiple sources. And then I'll think, and I'll put it together in my own way of thinking about it. And I'll be open-minded to how other people talk about it and learn from that. I mean, that's the beauty of the Supreme Court. There's 7 of us around a table. We're all reading the same facts, and we all know the law. And then together, critically, we talk about what the rule of law should be from this. And with 7 people on board, it's quite a discussion.
You mean you don't agree on everything every time?
I wish we did. I wish we did.
No, I can imagine that is. But again, as you spoke to earlier, that's how the system was designed, and it's an amazing way to make rulings and to make law, and that's the beauty of our system. But one thing you mentioned about the understanding the future of California that I think is most interesting to me as a policymaker is that declining birth rate and the aging population, because I think those two things combined are going to lead to a lot of new challenges in California, really challenges we've never really faced before. And I'm sure these trends are happening across the country as well. But I mean, it's going to be, over time, we're going to see a lot of adjustments, and we're going to need to adjust things in our budget. We're going to need to adjust how we're approaching policy in California. And the migration issue too out of California is another thing I'm really, as a legislator, focused on finding out, what's driving people out. I think I know a lot of the reasons. Obviously things have gotten very expensive in California, and there are a lot of things we can do to increase affordability, but just all of this information is so important, and I love that PPIC is at the cutting edge of it. Well, thank you, Tani, for joining me today. This was a really wonderful conversation. I did want to make sure people know about your website. It's ppic.org, if I have that right. And definitely, I encourage everyone to go there, check out what PPIC is doing. I'm sure you'll learn something really amazing as well. From their reports and their studies, and maybe you can even attend a lunch, or people are welcome to attend. Is that open to the public, or how does that work?
Just sign up, and it's free, and you can also go online and watch it while it's happening, and we archive everything too, so it's all available.
That's amazing. So please go to ppic.org and check that out. We are wrapping up here. Did you have any final thoughts before we close? Anything else you wanted to highlight before we send you on your way?
Well, just to say, Assemblyman Hoover, thank you so much for your passion and your leadership, and you care, and you're making it happen, and that you're a part of the problem-solving caucus, which I think is an exemplary model that the world could learn from. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you for your interest at PPIC.
I appreciate that. And honestly, the Problem Solvers Caucus too relies heavily on PPIC materials and things that, again, have that bipartisan or nonpartisan angle, because it is really important as a policymaker looking to actually find solutions, right, to some of California's biggest challenges. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I did also want to mention you can follow PPIC on X or Twitter, whatever people are calling it these days, at PPIC Notes. You can follow myself at Joshua_Hoover. Tani, thanks again for joining us, and maybe we'll have you on again.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
See you next time.